Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers, and every single click counts. And today's Commander deck is going to be focused around me, the Immortal. For 2 colorless, 1 green, 1 blue, and 1 red, she's a legendary creature, human rogue 3/3 with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, put your choice of a +1/+1, first strike, vigilance, or menace counter on me, the Immortal. Counters remain on me as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library, and you may cast me from your graveyard by discarding 2 cards in addition to paying its other costs. So this is a really sweet new commander from the set. It really got all of my brewer's senses going as soon as I saw it spoiled, because there's just so many different possibilities for what you can do with a commander like this. She is a little bit narrow in the sense that you do want to be playing basically keyword counters and of course also regular +1/+1 counters with her, but there is then also an element to her that isn't quite as narrow, because you can build around a bunch of different things. You can go more in on just a +1/+1 angle, you can go in on the card draw angle so you always have a full hand to pitch cards to reanimate her. You can then kind of build your own monster as well if you decide to go for specific keywords such as giving her a hexproof and indestructibility. There's just a bunch of different things that you can kind of build around, and they're all going to be quite interesting and fun. I do think that she's very strong due mostly to that recursion ability. That makes her better even than something like Skullbriar, because it kind of means that you can bypass command attacks completely, and we've seen how strong that can be in commanders such as Yuriko, and that in combination with her keeping her counters when she goes to any zone means that she is going to be an absolute menace to deal with, and your opponents better have a way to deal with the cards in your hand or have a ton of removal to get rid of her. Anyway, without further ado, let's get started. And for creatures, we're starting off with Aki Battle Squad. This card obviously works very well in any deck that is based around counters, such as this one. It's going to allow us to get 2 combat steps for all of our modified creatures. Me is always going to be modified. A lot of our other creatures are going to be modified too, so this seems very strong. Armorcraft Judge is a staple in any +1/+1 counter deck, and it's going to draw us a lot of cards in this deck. Avon Courier I think is a really interesting one, because we get to double up our counters that are on me and put them onto another creature as well. That means that if me, say, has an indestructible counter, we can then put an indestructible counter on a different creature we control whenever this attacks. That does mean that we can kind of stop all of our eggs from being in one basket as much, and should make for very interesting situations. Avian Oddity is a card that we're basically never looking to hard cast. We almost always just want to cycle it, at which point we're drawing a card and putting a flying counter on me, which is really good. With all of these cards that put keyword counters on me, we should make sure to remember that our opponents can respond to us putting the counter on by using removal on me, and in that sense the counter will never get put on, and therefore she won't have it. So make sure that if you really care about the counter that you're trying to put on, that the coast is clear when you go for it. Beast Whisperer is going to draw us a lot of cards because we are running 37 creatures in the deck. Benevolent Hydra is excellent in any deck with a bunch of counters in, such as this one. The tap ability is actually much better than it looks as well, because it's going to use its own replacement effect. So when you remove a +1/+1 counter from this, you're essentially going to be putting 2 +1/+1 counters on something else. Biophagus is a really good ramp card that also gets to put a counter on whatever we cast with it. Cankabloom is seeing so much play that it's almost a staple at this point, and it fits very well in this deck thanks to Proliferate. Crystalline Giant is a really sweet one that can get a counter every single turn, and then once it starts getting all those different counters, we can either duplicate them or move them onto me, and it's just going to be a really great way to get all sorts of different keywords on her. Danny Pink is really powerful in any deck that runs a bunch of counters, because even though this ability can only trigger once per turn, that's basically all you need. If you're drawing 2 or 3 cards per turn with this, you're going to be pretty happy. One thing to note is that a single Proliferate effect will draw you a card for each creature with a counter on it. That's incredibly strong. Deep Glow Skate is another card that works with Danny Pink, and it's just going to be so good in a deck that's looking to Voltron out and have a bunch of big creatures. The good thing about this deck as well that I didn't really mention earlier is that it can act as a Voltron deck or as a regular go wide counters deck, so this works pretty well with both of those strategies. Defiler of Vigor is going to be really solid. We are running quite a few green permanents, so this is going to trigger quite a bit. Duskshell Crawler is a really interesting one in that it doesn't necessarily give a keyword ability, but it should be giving trample to most of our team, which can be really huge. Evolution Sage works really well with all of our effects that care about counters being put on stuff, such as Danny Pink, and it's going to be triggering a lot. This also means that you might end up with extra keyword counters on me that you can then move on to other creatures. Fathom Mage is a great way to draw cards in a counter deck, and she's definitely going to draw us quite a few here. Forgotten Agent is a card that's seeing less and less play. these days, but I still think it's a pretty powerful effect in the right deck. It can grow really huge, and in this deck in particular, we can just dump all of the counters onto me, safe in the knowledge that they're not going anywhere. Goldberry River Daughter is going to work really well with me, because you can take one of each counter that you put on me and put them all onto Goldberry, which should immediately make her into a pretty reasonable threat. We can also use her to move counters from her onto something else and draw a card for our troubles as well. Gyre Sage should end up being quite big in this deck, which means that it's going to tap for a lot of mana. Halana and Elena is really solid, because we're probably going to be pumping it quite a bit with all the +1/+1 counters we have, which means that they're going to be even more effective of pumping up me or one of our other creatures. Hexavus is a good way to put a flying counter on our commander. Colonian Hydra is amazing in any deck that's focused around counters, and this is no exception. It's going to double all the counters on our creatures when it attacks, which should be game over pretty quickly. Kami of Whispered Hopes is a great hardened scales effect that also is basically its own version of Gyre Sage. Polak Fury of Avernus should help finish the game quite quickly by giving us extra combat steps. Kodama of the West Tree is going to be very good with all of the modified creatures we have. It should mean that we can search up most of the lands from our deck pretty quickly, which means that we'll almost always be drawing gas later. Mana Gorger Hydra is not usually quite good enough in Commander, but in this deck that is so based around counters, this offers a good way to keep getting counters on our creatures. It also works really well with Danny Pink, because if you have Danny Pink in play, you can basically draw a card on each of your opponent's turns as long as they play a spell. Master Biomancer is an old classic that I've always been pretty fond of. It's usually just going to make creatures come in with 2 counters on them, but if you manage to pump his power, which isn't difficult, then it's going to make creatures come in with a huge boost. Pure Imaginative Rascal is another card that I've always really liked. It's going to give extra counters for all kinds of counters, including those keyword counters as well. Scavenged Brawler is a sweet one that can put all sorts of counters on our creatures. It's really good because on the front side, before it dies, it's a decent creature with lifelink and vigilance, which is going to be a pain for our opponents to attack through, particularly once we start putting counters on it. But then when it dies, we can just exile it and put a ton of keyword counters on our commander, which is really sweet. Slippery Bogbonder is one of the key cards in the deck. We can flash it in to protect me and put a hexproof counter on her, which should make it very difficult for our opponents to interact with her. Tangled Florahedron is just a nice little ramp card. Thrumming Bird I really like in this kind of deck because it's an easy way to keep getting proliferate effects that are just going to grow our board. Tiano Rex is another card that we can cycle to give a keyword counter to our commander. Toothy Imaginary Friend is one of my favorite cards. It's going to get really big, and then when it leaves the battlefield for whatever reason, we're just going to draw a ton of cards. Vorinclex Monstrous Raider is a really powerful card in the deck. It is a little bit expensive, but it's so good that I thought I'd still include it. Doubling counters on creatures we control is just that good. Winged Hive Tyrant again doesn't give a keyword counter, but it does make sure that all of our creatures that come in with any sort of counters on them are going to be able to attack immediately and get flying, which is really powerful. And Sepher Singer is a slightly odd one because it is a way to put a flying counter on our commander, but we'd have to tap her down to do that, which means that we wouldn't be able to attack with her that turn. Obviously, we're not that interested in doing that, but seeing as me has a bunch of ways to get vigilance, not least of which is her own ability, we could just attack with her first and then convoke this out later on. Moving on to instants, we have Fully Grown, which is a little bit expensive, but does put a trample counter on our commander. Gaia's Gift is a good way to give all sorts of different kinds of protection, and it can also give trample in a pinch, so this can come out of nowhere to win us a game. Inspiring Call can protect our board and draw us a bunch of cards. Invigorating Surge is another way we can just win the game out of nowhere by doubling the amount of counters on me at instant speed. Kazu's Fury allows us to sacrifice our me to deal a ton of damage to our opponents, and since we can just recast her again from the graveyard, it's not really much of a loss. Quandrix Command is really powerful in this deck. It can act as a bounce spell in a pinch, which can be really useful. It can destroy an artifact or enchantment, which is always good. Putting 2+1/+1 counters on a creature is usually the worst mode, but it's quite good here, and it actually allows us to interact with graveyard shenanigans as well, so it just does so many different things, and they're all very good. Silk Guard is a great way to give our stuff hexproof at instant speed. It's usually going to be useful just to protect me, but it can actually work on any modified creatures. Slip Out the Back is a great way to make sure that me doesn't get wiped by a board wipe, even though most of the time we don't care because we're just going to be able to recast her. It is still nice to have the option to keep her safe. And Vastwood Fortification is just a land that can also put a +1/+1 counter on our commander. Moving on to sorceries, we have Rishkar's Expertise, which is going to draw us a lot of cards and allow us to play something for free. Spectacular Showdown is really good because whilst we're putting a double strike counter on all creatures if we overload it, we also don't mind just playing it for 2 mana, seeing as putting a double strike counter on me is going to be so powerful. And Unnatural Restoration is a way to return a card from our graveyard to our hand whilst proliferating. Moving on to artifacts, we have Agents Counters Toolkit. This is a really great way to get some counters on me that she might not necessarily have. Shield counters are particularly good because we can then proliferate them and move copies of them onto other creatures. Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, is really good because again it's going to make sure that we put extra +1/+1 counters every time we do so. Shadow Spear can be really good by giving me lifelink to make sure that we don't just get aggroed out. Staff of Completion is just a really versatile card in this deck. It can do so many different things that are all very good. Footfoot Boots can make sure that me has haste once we recast her from our graveyard, and the Great Henge is just a fantastic card in any deck, but in this deck in particular where we care about counters, it's particularly good. For enchantments, we have Court of Garen Brig. This is very good if we're the Monarch, and we should be able to retain the Monarchy fairly well, and if we do, we're going to double our +1/+1 counters on all of our creatures, which should end the game very quickly. Greater Good is fantastic in this deck because sacrificing me doesn't really cost us much at all, so once she's pretty big, we can just sacrifice her, draw a bunch of cards, discard 2 of those cards, and just immediately play her again. That's really powerful. Hardened Scales is obviously a classic in any deck running this many counters. Invigorating Hot Spring is a good way to make sure that me has haste once we recast her from our graveyard. And Uncivil Unrest is basically going to double all the damage that our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them are going to deal, which is super strong, particularly with our commander. Moving on to lands, we have Khan's Bastion, which is going to allow us to proliferate from our land slot. Nesting Grounds is going to be really good to get counters onto me from our other permanents, or vice versa. Oran Reef the Vastwood can be a very strong card in a deck like this by putting +1/+1 counters on all the creatures that have entered the battlefield that turn. Reliquary Tower makes sure that we're never going to run out of cards to pitch to me. Rogue's Passage is a really powerful effect in this deck because making sure that me is unblockable is going to be great. Tyrite Sanctum is perfect for this deck, so we're going to make me a god with the first activation, and she's going to get a +1/+1 counter, and then when we're ready, we can pay 4 mana and sacrifice it to put an indestructible counter on her. And Witch's Clinic is a really good way to make sure we stay healthy by giving me lifelink until end of turn. So there you have it. That has been our Me the Immortal deck tech. I'm actually really excited about this one because I've always loved counters decks and I don't currently own one, so I might end up throwing this together and see how it plays. What do you think about this one? Are you as excited as me? Do you think there's anything I missed or any cards I shouldn't have included? Do let me know in the comment section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.